Good evening and welcome to the Pompey Politics Podcast.
I'm Ian Tiny Morris.
And I'm Simon Sansbury.
If I could ask you to just introduce yourselves, the ward that you represent and the party that you're part of. And if I could start with yourself, Mark, as I know you're there, and then pass round your colleagues until we've covered everybody.
Hi, I'm Mark Coates. I represent Hayling East, new councillor as of May this year.
I'm Paul Gray. I represent Hayling West, and I am also a new councillor as of this May.
And I think one Labour, one Lib Dem. And
I'm a Liberal
Democrat,
colleague, not the Labour Party. That's right.
Yeah. Neither of you should be ashamed. Come on, pass to your colleagues.
If we can take Gillian and Amy next.
Hello, I'm Gillian Harris. I'm the Labour councillor in St Faith's ward.
And I'm Amy Redsull. I'm the Warren Park ward councillor and I represent the Labour Party and I've done so since May last year.
And I'm Philippa Gray. I'm a Lib Dem representing Bedhampton ward. I'm not related to Paul in any way. We are both Liberal Democrats. And we do both have the same surname, but last bit is pure coincidence.
Do you know what? I did not know that. Well, that shows how good our research was. Okay, so we just had a minor...
And Grainne.
Hi, I'm Grainne. I am representing the Emsworth ward. I was elected in May for the Havant Green Party.
Marvellous. Thank you for that. So we've got a range of questions. Obviously, with so many guests this evening, we'll ask. We've arranged to ask one of our principal guests to answer the question. But if you think there are some issues that we've missed, then please feel free to chip in. I'll kick off with the first question, just while Simon is wrestling with the gremlins. And can I address this first to Philippa, please? So for those folk who don't know the Havant Borough, obviously you've got wards sort of as diverse as Emsworth, Bedhampton, I mentioned Warren Park, Hayling Island. What are the similarities and differences, and how would you say the sort of Havant Borough as a whole differs from Portsmouth?
All right. That is the only question for the podcast, isn't it, Ian? And I do have the rest of it to answer, I hope. It's a big question. Skim over a few of the differences. Start with Havant. It's called Havant Borough. I always saw Havant as a railway junction, but it's a manufacturing town with a long history of creating very good quality goods. Gloves made from kid leather, produced the parchment on which the Treaty of Versailles was written. Emsworth was a little fishing village next door to it. Absolutely delightful. On the other side, Bedhampton, where I live, used to be farmland, mentioned in Rural Rides by William Cobbett, if you remember your history lesson and the Victorians. Going north, we have Leigh Park, which is built as a huge council estate to take people from Portsmouth after World War II. And then you go further north, you've got Stakes, Herbrook, Waterlooville, named after the pub that was named after the Battle of Waterloo. That was the heroes of Waterloo. Cowplain, Hart Plain. I think I've covered everywhere. But from my perspective, say you could debate the differences all night. You could talk about the differences between a small town like Havant and a city like Portsmouth. But what matters and what's motivated, part of my motivation to become a councillor, is everybody should have a sense of place. I've got a strong sense of what Bedhampton means to me. I doubt it's identical to what Bedhampton means to any other residents. I say plenty of scope for argument. But the role of the council is to create that sense of place. Give us somewhere that looks good. Create a sense of cohesion. We need somewhere that's pleasant to live, somewhere we can enjoy living, and yeah, somewhere that's interesting. So does that answer your question, Ian?
It does, Philippa. Thank you. Would any of the other councillors like to chip in on any of the other sort of variations and similarities that they see?
Right. Are you turning to me? Well, I'm going to speak as the other outsider because I'm obviously not from here, and I have lived in other places. And and I've lived in Portsmouth. And what I see about Portsmouth is it's got a very, very strong identity. I mean, nobody in Portsmouth doesn't know where they're living. It's Pompey, Pompey, Pompey. It's got the football club, it's got the dockyard, it's got a lot of things that bring everybody together. So I see it's a little bit different, but it's still very clearly Portsmouth. Havant is basically 5 places that have been molded together, or not, as the case may be, and it's really, really, really difficult to actually create a cohesive identity across the borough, because people in Hayling do not want to see themselves as associated with Leigh Park, and Leigh Park don't want to be associated with Emsworth, say, or every single part of Havant has a strong identity all of its own.
I was going to say something, but I think Grainne's probably just said absolutely everything. I was just going to say it from the Hayling point of view. So yeah, exactly that. Basically, you'll be hard pushed to convince a Hayling Islander that they have any real sense of the Havant Borough as one entity. A Hayling Islander is a Hayling Islander, and they'll associate with Portsmouth as readily as they'll associate with Emsworth, say, for argument's sake.
No, that's excellent, and it does speak to some similarities within Portsmouth. You know, there is a debate as to whether, you know, Simon and myself, who both live in Cosham, which is off the island, whether we can truly claim Portsmouthian identity. So no, a lot of similarities.
Yeah, don't start that one on. It's a friendly show, Ian. People will start getting.
We'll try. Yeah. We'll try and keep it pleasant. Simon, over to yourself.
Okay, so I guess you can't really escape the impact of Portsmouth. So so much of the housing in the borough was built as an overflow for Portsmouth. What would you see Havant Borough Council do to address its own housing needs? And if I can address that first to Amy, please.
No. So trying not to teach grandma to suck eggs, housing is a massive issue nationally, and there has been a deficit in social properties and affordable properties, and that can date back to the times of when Thatcher introduced the right to buy. And for many households, that was a gateway to home ownership, and especially in Leigh Park. So I'm the 3rd generation of Leigh Park. My grandparents were the first, my mother the 2nd. And being able to buy their own home was a massive thing for my grandparents. It was something that they never thought they'd ever be able to do, and that policy allowed them to do that. But when that policy was introduced, there was no buying or building of additional properties, which meant that for each property that was sold, that wasn't being replaced. And now, 40 years down the line, nearly 50 years down the line, we're seeing major deficits in housing. And I think you can also attribute that to the increase and the introduction of buy-to-let landlords and property developers. For example, if you look at a 1-bedroom flat on Rightmove today, the price of that would be £850 per calendar month. And for the local housing allowance rate for a 1-bedroom, assuming that comes under the Portsmouth rate, would be £583.39 a month, which is quite a large deficit. So realistically, what needs to be done with local housing allowance being frozen on a more local level, we need to be introducing, in my opinion, rent caps and the ability to regulate the market from a council perspective to ensure that our most vulnerable households are able to support themselves and are able to rent in an area that they grew up in. Me, for example, I grew up in Leigh Park. I grew up in West Leigh. I'd never lived anywhere else in my life other than for 2 years when I was at university. And I ended up moving back because I was homesick. There was no chance I would ever have been able to rent a property of my own. And I was only fortunate enough that my parents let me live in their spare room for the last nearly 5 years to be able to afford to buy my own property. But that isn't the same for everyone. And more needs to be done on a government level to increase the LHA rates, and more needs to be done on a council level to ensure that more properties are being built, and they're not just affordable properties, that they are social properties. at the last full council meeting, statistics showed that 1,500 people were registered on Hampshire Home Choice, which is the choice-based letting system, haven't used. And we're just not building enough properties to meet that demand. I mean, 38 properties, that is a big feat, and we should be celebrating it. But in the same way, we need to be encouraging more growth and more social properties being built.
Thank you very much. Did any of your colleagues want to come in on that one at all?
Can I just say, I think that's an absolutely stunning answer from Amy. I mean, she's an expert in this particular field.
It shows, doesn't it?
I don't think anyone could have answered that any better. And I think your listeners are jolly lucky. They've tuned in and they've got any interest in housing.
Isn't lovely?
At the right time.
Yep.
Yeah, no, Amy, it was an excellent summary, and I was nodding my head all the way through because you have a very clear analysis of A, what caused the problem, B, how we might get out of it. I mean, it's very complex. Nobody's saying it's easy, but we do need a change in political will, and that's what's missing. That is what's missing. It's a political will to cure this problem that's basically missing. And I could say things here that I'm not going to say, but that political will is the key to this. The key to a lot of things.
Let me tempt you then, which is that is this within the gift of Havant Borough Council to fix? I lived in the borough for 5 years when there were lots of estates going up, and there was percentages of social housing in them, but there was always a tension from the local residents when more houses were due to be built. I remember, for years walking to work, I walked past the fields just at the end of New Lane by the railway line there that then became a housing estate. Is it something that Havant Borough actually have the, do they have the ability to solve the problem, or is this one that's got to be kicked down the street to national government to solve?
Sorry, Grainne, you want to go?
No, go ahead, Paul, because I've spoken a lot.
There are two parts to the answer. Certainly, national government is part of the problem. The absurd system we have in this country, which basically places the immediate burden for additional housing on those areas which are already the more densely populated areas. It's an absurdity which goes against the fundamentals of the whole of human evolution, essentially. However, there is a lot more scope for doing it than you will often be told. It is perfectly possible to build your allocation of housing outside of the boundaries of your borough if it's reasonably demonstrable that you cannot do it within your boundaries. So there is provision for local councils. The Conservatives in Havant have been particularly good at trying to say it's not our fault, this is what's being pushed on us. Actually, it's a lack of imagination and a lack of effort, in my view, on their part. There is the capacity to do this. There is even the capacity to actually benefit from doing this in conjunction with other neighbouring authorities, which have far more available space. I think it actually comes back to really fundamentally the point that Grainne made, that this can be done. It's about political will to actually do it, essentially. But certainly the mechanisms are there in place, and I think excuses have been made at a local level, and it sort of passed, certainly here and haven't passed between the local MP claiming it's solely a matter for the local council, and then the local council saying it's solely a matter for Westminster. That is not an accurate reflection, and certainly Havant Borough Council could go far further to solving the problem.
I was going to also say, I think what we have, what the problem with Havant is that our local plan was rejected by the government in November 21. I was going to come to this a bit later on, but because we have no local plan, the council hasn't got a basis on which to accept or reject planning applications. And our developers, the developers like to build big 5, 4, 6 bedroomed houses because that's how they make their money, and they don't want to put in applications to build affordable housing because it's not. But if we had a local plan, we would be able to force the issue a little bit more. So, until we get a local plan of how we're going to build this, and we need the political will to get that done. We're in a rock and a hard place, really.
Thank you, folks. I will move on to question 3. So this is about the Hayling Ferry. So the harbour fees are going up 366%. There's a lack of travel subsidy for the Hayling Ferry. So could I ask Mark and Paul, obviously there was come as a twofer with matters Hayling, why is the Hayling Ferry so important, and what needs to be done to continue to make that service viable?
Well, for us, it's a vital service. It's the only other route off of Hayling apart from that Vaniel Road that goes over the Langston Bridge, and it is part of the Hayling Resilience Plan. It's also something that brings a good deal of people to the islands, about 50-ish thousand. If we fall a bit short of that, then it's in danger of not breaking even, certainly under the current restructure of license fees and per passenger fees. But those people, it's about half and half. 25,000 people coming onto the island, and during the Victorious Festival, for example, they weren't just coming over to the ferry boat to have a couple of chips and a couple of beers and then go back again. They were coming over to stay at the Oven and some of the other campsites, spend money over a couple of days. I mean, the multiplier effect in action. We were taking a fair slice of the money that came through that Victorious Festival, and that was just over that weekend. And the ferry linked up with an open-top bus that went right the way across. I mean, it's good for big events, but then during the winter, of course, those numbers dwindle enormously, and it's the summer trade that actually subsidises the winter, but it's still there. And during home match days, you get people going across to myself included, to watch Pompey, and it's just something that gives us an access and freedom. I mean, you'll talk a bit about the environmental aspect as well, and I'm stunned. For me, I don't know whether or not to blame Langstone Harbour Board, because everyone's looking for money, and I'm not critical holistically of Langstone Harbour Board, but on this issue, I think I've got to question them, because I'm not sure they're doing what they're there for. They're not actually looking after users. They're not making the place viable, and looking after the people either side of it. They've let us down. But do I blame them, or do I blame the governance? March 2022 is when they suddenly went from this tiered 15p all the way through to 50p to this flat rate of 50p, and then the following year 55p out of nowhere. And 366% is just going to crush it. And then you start wondering, well, are they trying to squeeze it out of business? And you get your tinfoil hat on. I just don't understand the rationale for that. Why crush a local service that's there for users when you're a statutory body whose purpose it is to make sure people can use Langstone Harbour, and it just doesn't all add up for me, not mathematically, but in terms of their statutory obligations. And I was fuming, and obviously gave a few quotes to the press, and it was front page Friday.
And then there are actually some wider questions there as well about what its purpose is. Is it there for social good? Now, I think most of us would agree that in principle it is there as something more than just but something to be a business. However, if you view it purely from the point of view of the harbour, the ferry itself also is a key client of the harbour. It's actually quite a big revenue generator in relation to the pontoon that exists there. So it becomes somewhat complex in that it depends how you view the nature and the necessity of the harbour and what the harbour's meant to be providing. But even if you argue that it's meant to be there for social good, then there is argument for subsidy. And if the argument is that actually you have to view this purely as a business, then you have to view that ferry as a big paying client to the Harbour Board, effectively. So, I mean, however you cut it, the Hayling Ferry is a service which provides a vital, I mean, Mark's talking about that link that it provides, particularly during the winter as well, which is out of service, doesn't necessarily make a profit, but does provide an additional link from Hayling Island to the mainland. What we need to be able to do, and what I think we would all like to see in the future, is that service encouraged and interconnectivity built up around it. Because, you only have to look on a map. The route from Hayling Island over to Portsmouth in an era when we're actually trying to save car journeys and we're trying not to pollute. The route from Hayling Island to Portsmouth, with the car journeys that get made every day, is a social bad. There is a strong argument to say that we subsidise for the benefit of the social good, build that service up, and any profit made is actually reinvested in that harbour and in a more sustainable future. If again we only view it as a business, then you can lose that argument. but then you have to raise all sorts of questions about how you're treating that key client.
Yeah, and whether or not it's equitable as well.
Well, absolutely. And I think Mark and I could probably talk about this all day long.
Well,
and it does get complicated.
I'm going to stretch the answer a little bit more. I'm afraid, just to, I think they've had 150,000 in precepts, another 230,000 from DEFRA, and then a £20,000 hike on the ferry. They've taken over £100,000 in the last 7 years since we started it back up again. And for people to start talking about, and I've heard this from some members of LHB, it's not our job to subsidise the ferry. You're not. You've made over 100 grand on it the last 7 years. It's not the ferry's job to subsidise you. And actually, in Hitchinor and Hamble and Hyde, it's free to. There's nothing. There's no fee at all for the ferry. They just let it run because it's a public good in everything that Paul's just nailed.
And again, if you ignore all that public good argument, you're still faced with the argument that then if you're running a supposedly profitable business, you have to treat that ferry as a luxury client that you want to hang on to, basically, not as someone who is subsidising other areas of your operation, because it is definitely bad business management to lose a client that will be giving you anywhere between £10,000 and £30,000 a year.
And in a nutshell, they're killing the golden goose, and we don't get it, and that's why the tinfoil hat goes on sometimes. Don't understand why they're killing the gold.
So would anybody else like to come in on that? The Hayling Ferry, is it, again, we never want to offend Paul and Mark. Is it just a Hayling Island thing, or is it does it have more potential benefits for the wider Havant community as a whole?
I'll show you my Hayling Ferry tattoo if you like.
It depends on where it is, to be honest.
Well,
I think they've said it exactly. It's more than just. It's more than a business. It's a service, and it connects Hayling to Portsmouth. Mark and I've even talked about. Actually, we should probably build a tunnel under from Hayling to Portsmouth to connect the two up a bit more. But to take that ferry away is absolute nonsense. So I support everything that they've just said.
Yeah.
And I really do think if there's one key argument that, regardless of everything else, that I think certainly everyone in this opposition, I think, would be in agreement with, is the point about sustainable travel in the future. We really do have to, I'm all in favour of getting people out of their cars, but I'm equally one of those people who can. I can get a little bit queasy sometimes, and when sometimes people on, if you like, our side of the political fence preach these things to people and don't offer alternative solutions. Well, the Hayling Ferry is a perfect example of an alternative solution. If we're going to get people out of their vehicles, these are exactly the things that we need to be providing, and the state needs to be looking at what provision it can include with that as a social good, basically. And this is no different to saying, why we tax. Why we subsidise healthcare, for example, and why we tax cigarettes. These are perfectly normal things that we do within any society. We support those things which have a wider social good.
But I mean, as it happens, it doesn't need subsidy; it just needs
support. It doesn't
need to be ripped off.
Yeah.
And on that note, with subsidising, I mean, there's been an increase in people using the buses since they've had the £2 fare caps. And I know that within the Portsmouth city boundaries, they're offering free buses now on a weekend, on a Saturday, I believe it is. And I know a few of my friends who live downtown who are like making the most and going out with their friends, which is, increasing the revenue that the city is getting, because there's more incentive for them to ditch their cars and to go out. And then they can go down to a local bar, have a couple of drinks, and they know they can get the bus home. And it's exactly like that. I mean, if I was to go out with my husband, where my bus route previously was very, very poor, we'd have to drive, and we wouldn't really have an option, because it's either drive or you have to be home by 6 p.m. And I don't really want to have my dinner at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So, fortunately now we live quite near to various different bus routes. I think we worked out the other day, we're on 4 different bus routes now, which is great for us because we're both trying to cut down on our emissions, and we're both able to, plan a whole day out and go down to Portsmouth, go and do a bit of shopping, have a bite to eat, and then still get home at a reasonable time. But I do agree entirely that more needs to be done to support public transport, including
absolutely. I'll just chip in to say that the Department of Transport seem to have decided that they are not investing in the future. And you can look at the closing of the ticket railway ticket officers as an example of that. They are not interested in growing the business. They seem to be interested in saving money today, save a penny today, and charge a pound the next time. I mean, all of these things are so short term.
Just final little question on the. So obviously the Hayling Ferry has two sides to it. Are you getting any interest, support, or kind of, you know, is there a same feeling coming from the ward councillors in Portsmouth, where the Hayling Ferry lands?
I have to say, I think that when I went to the meeting last Friday, I did not see anyone there. You know, I know that Paul will support when he goes to the board meetings. I was astounded that there was no recognition actually about what they'd done. There was no humility about the fact that they have totally inappropriately put a completely random, inexplicable fee that is going to crush that service into place. I think they seem to be in denial, and I have to say I'm quite critical in a totally non-partisan way across the board of everyone who was there on that issue. And it is just that issue. They brought obviously lots to the table and various other. It's not just about that meeting was not just about the ferry. They brought lots to the table on all the other issues, and the Harbour Board had some great plans. I mean, there were plans. I'm sure they're not private, where they were thinking about having mussels again in the harbour. There was conversation about that, and they're ambitious in some really good ways. But on this issue, I think they really haven't been paying attention.
I think there's perhaps just worth noting that there's a slight difference between who is on the board and some of the wider views of the councillors in Portsmouth. So there has historically been a lot of I would actually say there's been historically a lot of positive support from councillors over on the Portsmouth side, but perhaps more focused on that interconnectivity and the service and how it operationally runs, rather than necessarily the management and oversight of it necessarily. So perhaps that's just a distinction that's worth making.
It's interesting. It's not a particularly partisan issue, and as you know, I've talked about in the last one was Councillor Claire Satchwell, as she was then, Buchanan now, after getting married. She was absolutely excellent on the ferry. She was on her mettle, knew what she was doing. Trust. Obviously, I chipped in my half, and together we spearheaded that campaign. And and it was all about just being effective and supporting residents. Does not have to be a partisan issue, and if it is, I'll tell you what, the people who are on the side of the ferry are going to make massive headway locally, massive headway, and they need to be ready for that.
Perfect. Thank you, folks. I'll hand you over to Simon.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Staying in the environs of the harbour, with regular with sewage, the sewage processing plant at Bud's Farm regularly discharging into the harbour, how do residents feel about having to pay to have their own poo? You could use different words, but we've gone with that. To have their own poo pumped back into the waters that they swim, paddle, surf or sail in. And if I can ask that first to Grainne, please.
Okay, thank you. Well, how do you think they feel? They're fuming. They're furious.
Yeah, it was a bit of a leading question, to be fair. I do apologise.
The awareness of just what's been going on dumping sewage has been slow to grow outside of the area, but thanks to recent campaigns by Mayday and Fergal Sharkey and the BBC have now picked it up. The awareness is there, because we have a situation where we have not just storm discharges, which are legal, but also dry weather discharges, which definitely aren't. And climate change is magnifying the issue because we have more heavy rain and therefore more times when they will have to release the sewage. But the water companies, I mean, it's now, the stuff is out there just about how much they've creamed off in terms of £74 billion has been paid to shareholders and investors since they were privatised in 1989, and we're the only the first place in the world to privatise water, and it's an absolute disaster because we either have an infrastructure that is funded for us and by us, or we have this system, which is effectively allowing foreign investors, because they mostly are, to hoover money out of the country, because that's actually what's happening. And I met a local international environmental lawyer in Emsworth, who told me that she had actually spoken to the United Nations about privatizing water, and that she used Southern Water as a test case to show why you never privatize your water. It should never have been privatized. However, we are in this situation. So now the water companies are recognizing, oh, wait, you've got a big PR problem. And they're saying, oh, enforcement's not the way forward. I don't know what else. Enforcement is why it's gone wrong so far, because of what were set up to keep our bills low, which they have done because they've only increased 40% over decades, which, relatively speaking, and given that the water did need to, treatment did need to be improved, they haven't succeeded in that, but they've also taken their eye off the ball completely about what these companies are doing with their profits and how they're using the money. And it's not fair to say it's just the water companies, because they also have no control over the number of houses that are added into the system, because they are obliged to connect any new houses onto the water system. Now, down in Sinai Lane, you have that horrendous situation where the new homes there, they're not even connected to sewage, so they're collecting them in tankards because it's just absolutely awful. So the whole system does need, well, again, political will, just to put it right. You know, that's, I could go on. I mean, and people are mad now and they're saying, why are we paying for this? Well, I'm afraid to say, no choice, because the money is not going to come from those investors. That money's gone, gone, gone. And just to underline that, I learned recently that Portsmouth Water are raising the water bills by 50% by 2030. So in the next 7 years, our water bills for Portsmouth Water, now their reasoning is, this is cheap water. It's the cheapest in the country. It's cheapest in the country because up until now it's had the need less treatment than any other water. If you take water out of aquifers, that's kind of like costs 1 unit, whereas to take it out of a river is 3 to 4 times as much. And if you recycle it, traditional methods, you're talking about 15 times the cost. So, you know, that's the situation. So we're kind of, as I see it, people are now alert, and I think what can we do? Keep up the pressure, I would say. Keep talking about it, because what we need is to change that political will to put it right.
Thank you. Anyone else want to come in on the poo in our water?
If I can, sorry, I'm aware I've talked quite a bit.
No,
I've noticed that a lot.
You're here to talk. Don't worry. We're here to hear from you. That's the point.
You'll be a bit sick of me by the end, I'm sure. But I've noticed in a lot of full council meetings that across the board, regardless of political parties, there seems to be a very strong and coherent, almost consensus about the distaste and distrust we have towards some water, and I'll emphasise on the distaste again. It seems to me that it is a very clear issue for a lot of councillors that, our residents don't trust Southern Water. And I think not to blow my own trumpet, pretty much nailed that on the head when I said, irregardless of what political party and irregardless of what area of the borough we're representing, all of our residents are upset with the way that we're being treated by Southern Water and the way that the environment is being treated by Southern Water. And it just seems very painful to me that there are so many political figureheads who are identifying that this is an issue and that this is something that people are really concerned about, but they don't seem to want to do anything. Or whenever something is suggested, they want to almost create barriers to something being done. And it just seems that it's just it almost feels like you're just going around in circles sometimes. I don't know if anyone else feels the same on that.
I entirely agree with that, Amy. I think we're yet again going to say about the political will. I mean, it's felt very much to me like there are if I say two sides, it's about two mentalities. There seems to be a broad agreement about the problem, but as Amy just said, from one side there really seems to be this inherent fear almost of doing anything about it. I'd like to think that the group of people you've got here on your show tonight are the other side of that. But certainly that's what it's felt like to me, almost as if there is I don't know, a subconscious desire to be on the side of the shareholders and big business, even when actually in your conscious mind you're kind of openly saying it's wrong. So it is a frustrating situation when we are in a minority and feel that there isn't necessarily the political will to do more than actually just say the right words, basically, rather than take the right action.
And there's another aspect to this. Southern Water want to impose water recycling on us. They call it recycling, I call it processing. And they want to build what I think will be a very large further processing plant in Bedhampton, down by the foreshore, to take sewage from all over Hampshire, all over the south of England, process it till its eyes pop, and then put it into the Havant Thicket Reservoir, which nobody's mentioned directly. The reservoir we were promised years ago by Portsmouth Water. It was going to be beautiful. It was going to be filled with our wonderful Bedhampton spring water, and it was going to have leisure facilities incorporated, enhance all our lives. And then Southern Water pop up and announce they're going to put recycled sewage into it. And it seems there's not a lot we can do about it. A group of us in Bedhampton are fighting it, raising awareness, challenging Southern Water. But it's deemed to be a nationally important infrastructure project. So the decision about whether it will go ahead will be made in Westminster. So you've got this to look forward to.
And I agree, Philippa. The whole Havant Thicket Reservoir issue is sometimes detracts. That issue sometimes detracts from the sewage in the harbour. But they are intertwined. And the other thing I was just going to say, there is a little bit of the wider environmental impact of the sewage in the harbour. Just along from Bud's Farm, there's the sea wall has broken down and the sea's ingressed into Southmoor. Now, the coastal squeeze means that the harbours do need, with rising sea levels, the harbours do need more areas to flood onto, and that Southmoor was an ideal place. But the problem is that the water that's going over that area is sewage water, and so the promised salt marsh that ought to be growing as a result of that ingress, it's if you look at an aerial view of that area, it's just a horrible mess. It's not salt marsh at all. So we have the added problem in that the sewage affects the wildlife and the plants and things in the harbour and the intertidal area as well.
It certainly does.
Yeah. To be absolutely clear, there's nothing about the plans for recycling sewage that will reduce the impact of sewage flowing into Langston Harbour.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
To assume the two are linked, but no, there'll be just as much sewage flowing in as before.
I mean, Teresa Coffey was down not long ago. I saw her with Alan Mack. I think they were having a photo, and on the beach. And Teresa was saying how lovely the sea is around Hayling. Mm-hmm. I don't think she had a swim, but she'll be coming down later to make a decision on that wastewater recycling. Simon and Ian. So we'll see if we can grab her and get her on here.
And it speaks to the general distrust of the public when Teresa Coffey was down making that statement the other week. The local community on Hayling, the windsurfing community on Hayling, are basically just laughing at her. It's just a combination of anger and laughter because they know that what they're listening to is absolute drivel, basically. And we're on a tourist island. Again, we're losing money. Local businesses are losing money for this. And it doesn't help when a government minister comes down and spouts what is known to be drivel.
The sort of thing that goes into the harbour.
26% of people have not gone on the water this year in the UK because of their fears over the sewage.
And the truth is,
the sewage is known about into Langston and Chichester Harbour is known as far wide as Australia. because in November I met people from Australia who said, oh, we've heard about this, and that's why we're here on holiday, and that's why we haven't gone surfing here.
This island, and it's not touted enough, but this island is the home. It's where windsurfing was invented. It's part of the DNA of Hayling Island, and that is currently, that reputation, that history, everything that's associated with it is being destroyed because the world of windsurfing is learning that Hayling Island is surrounded by shit, if you'll excuse my language.
I think that sums the situation up. It's a topic we've covered on the podcast before, and I think it's definitely one we will pick up again until we see the change that, as you touched on, I think is everyone agrees what the problem is, and it's about time that a solution was found. So I'll just move us on to our next question, a subject very close to my heart as somebody who spent 23 years of my career toddling up and down New Lane. So with the closure of some of those big businesses like Wyeth that became Pfizer, and Procter & Gamble Tam brands in the middle of Leigh Park, and Kenwood being scaled back, is there a risk that Havant as a manufacturing town or site is starting to fade away and will end up being a kind of dormitory town where people come to, they sleep there but they go and work elsewhere? And can I address that first to Jill, please?
Oh, thank you. Well, that's an interesting question, given that the foray over the new Amazon warehouse that's just opened on New Lane earlier this year. So the decision to open that was taken before I was a councillor, but there was quite an astonishing lack of scrutiny in the planning process that allowed that development, because there's quite a lot of opposition to it from local residents. So yes, it did bring jobs to the area, but I think it's more a question of whether New Lane is the right place for those sorts of businesses, in that it's brought traffic, noise, and after it was open, we realised also light pollution to the adjoining residential areas on both sides of the railway. So there's a lot of disquiet about that big development there. We wanted, and we still want, the council to follow through on the promise to build a link road from New Lane over to the A27, which would certainly ease the traffic, both for businesses and for the increased number of houses being built in the area. So, and I'll just want to add at this point, there's also Havant Civic Society. I don't know if anybody knows their looks at their website and their news. They keep a very close eye on these things. They have raised the question about exactly how much business rate Amazon are paying for 32 New Lane. It doesn't appear to be paying any, so we'll quite question the nature of that development. So there's much to get to the bottom of there. So so bringing businesses to the Havant area, I mean, there are other areas. When the Amazon was being discussed, we thought that actually there's Dunsbury Park or there's Broadmarsh, right, both near the A3, A27 link, much easier to get onto the motorway network rather than be disruptive to local homes. So there's other places where businesses can be encouraged to build. There's obviously, yes, the Solent Road area as well. And I mentioned earlier on, we also doesn't have the local plan. As I said earlier, it was rejected by the government in November 21. We're still working on it, and without that plan, we don't have a policy to turn to. We're unable to regulate planning applications and can't. We're open to speculative developments that we don't necessarily want. So we do need to get that local plan in place. In the regeneration of Waterlooville, Havant Borough Council did suspend car parking charges in the car park there. And by all accounts, that was quite a success and brought people to shop in Waterlooville and to support the businesses. This is tricky because I do remember almost my first session as a training session as a councillor back in May this year. We were reminded very clearly of the amount of income that the borough gets from parking, and so don't mess with it was the underlying issue. But I do think we need to think about that because parking deters, high parking charges do deter people from coming to shop in places like Havant Centre, Leigh Park Centre, and Waterlooville. So we need to address that really. The light's fading in my room here. I can't see my notes. making Solent Road, with people park for free in Solent Road shops at Havant, we need to make the well signposted route across to Havant Centre so that people don't forget about the high street shops there. So there's various bits and pieces that can be done. I have had a complaint from parking in the Meridian Centre of a local business who was using their own vehicle to make deliveries to his business and was slapped a parking fee on because he didn't have an official delivery van parking in the delivery area. So we do need to listen to local proprietors and businesses and find out what they want and how we can support them to prosper their business as well, and work with that there is a shoplifting issue, so work with police on that. So there's various things we can do. And the one last thing I will say was going back to Havant Reservoir, they've put up a whole series of caravans for the local workers there, which implies that they're bringing in workers from elsewhere. And I do want to question why we're not employing local people to work on the reservoir as another source of jobs for the next few years, for a number of years.
Thank you, Jill. Anybody else want to come in on manufacturing and jobs in Havant?
Well, I had a quick look at what the jobs were in Havant, and 17.1% are retail, and then followed by education at 12% and construction at 9.8%. So I think your point about manufacturing and Havant, I think that ship might have sailed. Looking at the figures.
No, very sad. As I say, I spent 5 years with Gem Plus and then 18 years with Wyeth and Pfizer, and drove down New Lane the other day, and it appeared to be a shadow of what it once was. So,
if I can just add to the concept of dormitory town, is that all right? I just wonder if that's a reasonable phrase to use for not just for Havant, where there's an argument to suggest that, but for a large number of towns around the Brain Belt, so Oxford, Cambridge, Milton Keynes, where actually you've got a lot of houses being built. There's no obvious identity. There's not a lot of manufacturing. There's no jobs that seem to come organically from the area, but they're within range and they've got good transport links. And actually, on that basis, I think that Havant could still have an identity and still have a history and a future, but not necessarily centre around a specific industry. And I just wonder if we don't want to be too harsh on it just because it hasn't got a whopping great factory or an existing manufacturer that's thinking of of building and growing, and I think that we'll see more of this, of course, in all manufacturing towns up and down the country, but particularly the north where there's that massive gap.
Yeah. Sorry, I will say one thing. The thing about Havant is the jobs are at the bottom of the scale. For example, years ago when Langston Business Park employed 3,000 people, only 10% of them came from Havant, and virtually all of them were at the bottom of the scale. They were receptionists and cleaners. And if you look at the figures about the number of elementary jobs, as it were, in Havant, it's 21%, as against the southeast as a whole of 12%. So we are losing out on well-paid jobs.
Although to be fair, that reflects the demographics and the education level of the area.
Yeah.
It's a low education level, so actually the jobs. Although the converse of that, of course, is that if you look to bring in more white-collar, high-end jobs, if you like, then do you attract the people to the place? Therefore, is that what you want to do? And then equally, then are you then potentially alienating and making it more difficult for those people who actually are the working class roots of that community?
We need to build more aspiration into the local education, convince people that there's a wide range of jobs out there. They should, anything's possible. But the idea of a dormitory town, what used to be a dormitory town, is now a place that people work from home 2, 3, 4 days a week, and hopefully go out for lunch and use local services. So I think the whole thing needs rethinking.
Sorry, Philippa.
So it's just really important that our local school kids learn to aspire, learn that they can get qualifications. There are good jobs out there. and we need to bring some of those to Havant.
I've found whenever I've been out of work and trying to find work within Havant, the majority of those have been 0-hour contracts. And, you know, I can't pay the bills on a 0-hour contract because I don't know what I'm going to do 1 week from the next. You know, 1 week I might have 40 hours of work, the next week it might only be 12. And it's entirely, I mean, I've mentioned this before in full council meetings, and I'll mention it until I'm blue in the face, that we can't expect people to be happy with being given 0-hour contracts on the absolute bottom of the pay scales. We need to be building, you know, the aspiration. You know, I was very fortunate. I managed to get to university. I did university. It was the hardest 4 years of my life, but I did it. And now I'm in a point of my life where I'm wanting to work maybe a bit more locally, a bit more close to home. I'm very settled. And there is just not that opportunity. I think I've only ever had 2 jobs in Havant, and both of those have been retail jobs. So it is very difficult. And I think especially for young people leaving education where perhaps they don't want to go to university, where the only options within Havant are, you know, typically your shop jobs, your 0-hour contracts, it can deter people a bit from staying in the area. And I think it's so important to me as a Leigh Parker, if I may, to retain that. You know, I'm proud of being from the area, and my husband's recently moved into the area, and he's only been here like a month, 2 months now. And he said now he feels like a fully fledged Leigh Parker. He feels like he's part of the community. And that's what I love about the area. It is a community, it is a home, and it's a hub. And I think that not allowing people to have aspirations in terms of their career is really taken away from the part of the community that I think is the most important, and that is the people, the heart of it, if you will.
Perfect. Thank you. I'm going to hand over to Simon for question 6.
Okay. So, sorry, I've lost track then for a second. I for some reason in my head thought that we were going for 7 next. Sorry, I don't know where. So
we can head to 7 next if you want to, Simon, in terms of time.
But, that's fine. That was just me losing the plot a little bit. It's the heat getting to me. So Grainne, Havant being considered one of the safest blue seats in the country, although I'm not quite sure what counts for a safe blue seat these days. How can you make other voices and opinions heard? So that's the challenge for yourselves. I've got a little graphic that I'll put up that shows, obviously, you've got 30 Conservative councillors and 4 Labour councillors, 2 Liberal Dems and 1 Green and 1 Independent. How can you get those voices heard?
I think I would say the same as every single other person here, and that is that we work harder than anybody else. We work collaboratively. We give people a chance. What I find on the doorstep is that people really, really do want change. They need change. And if we put ourselves forward and show that, yes, you can have this change, then people are prepared to give us a chance. And it is about always being local first, middle and last, to be there for every single resident, to show that we can help. I mean, I think Mark and Paul and Amy and Gillian and Philippa have all for years been working, and it just hasn't come out of the blue, but people have realized, hold on, I do need change. These people are people I can trust. I can they will turn up, they'll go to meetings, they'll go to ward surgeries, they'll canvass events, they will volunteer, they work collaboratively. These are the people that are going to be different, and they're going to be brave. They're going to be speak up and say things that the other councillors... I notice that in council meetings now, that the other councillors are much more willing to actually speak up and say stuff. The meetings are lasting twice as long. And that's just by us being there. And I think the more people see that having opposition is good for everyone, the more people will be willing to put the money on this horse or that horse just to get a better representation. So that's my stick on it.
Thank you very much. Anyone else want to weigh in quickly on that one?
If I could just very much... Sorry, go on, Jill. You carry on.
Okay. What I was just saying, so I grew up around here, but I spent a lot of time in London, and I was fortunate enough to be in a Labour-run constituency. but and a Labour-run council. But I think we've got the same issue there in predominantly Labour as you've got here, predominantly Conservative. There is no scrutiny that goes on if you've got too many of one party. So hopefully we are demonstrating that just by we can ask questions, and we're raising the level of debate just by being there. And as Grainne said, as we've goaded other people into action as well. So I think it's healthy for democracy to have opposition parties, whatever the colours.
I'm very, very glad Jill said that, because I was going to say, and I've said before on this programme, and I said a lot before the election about the need for democracy, how Havant was a one-party state and how that was incredibly unhealthy for democracy. It's exactly that. And I think certainly we've unnerved a lot of people, going back to the point that Grainne made. I think initially we unnerved people, and now people are actually becoming far more comfortable speaking out now because of the difference that we've brought to the council effectively. And I think probably even for some council workers, it's without being critical of anyone, where you end up with that situation, it does sort of become this one happy family. Actually, for a lot of council staff, I think it can become quite ingrained effectively. Not that anyone is being deliberately biased, but it actually just opens up the whole organisation. The whole mentality of the place has to change when you have a group of people in opposition who are continually raising questions. Everyone has to be on their guard. No one can rest on their laurels. And that is essentially, I mean, again, it goes back to the ancient Greeks. You have to have that in opposition. You have to have opposition within a democracy. And if you don't, you will have, as Jill, and this is why I'm so happy that Jill mentioned it, you will have Labour councils in parts of the country which have been absolute Labour dominated for years and years and years. And effectively, you will see exactly the same thing where there is no opposition effectively. So I'd like to think that we've all, in our way, added to what Havant Borough Council is. And how, second part of your question, it's one of the safest seats. How do you get voices really heard? Well, again, I think we're getting our voices heard, but we're getting the voices of residents heard, who are, particularly an awful lot of them, non-partisan and just want to feel represented. And that again comes back to that key point: is it's not about party stripes, it's about the importance of opposition, full stop, within democracy.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think I'd say it in one word: comms. It's all about comms. And that doesn't just mean getting your voice out there, it means getting the residents' voices to you.
Perfect. You've segued us nicely into our final question, which is, we've playfully described you as a rebel alliance. Obviously, 3 parties represented today. I guess in a council like Havant, where you are the minority, what advantages do you have in terms of the way you organise yourselves? But then, are there advantages that the incumbent party / council have that means that you struggle to compete? And can I ask that to Paul?
Yeah, I think the first and most obvious thing to say is that and actually one thing that you can't be critical of the incumbent Conservatives for is there will always be a certain degree of it being difficult for us because we are numerically smaller. And actually that's democracy, and I have no objection whatsoever to that. How do we get ourselves a foothold in the door? I think all of us, since we've become councillors, have been at pains to actually make ourselves known within the council, to fit it and become part of that wider organisation. But equally to make it absolutely clear to the existing status quo that we are deliberately there, and we are there as opposition. We are not there to be part of the same clique. And I think that's genuinely been a little bit of a cultural problem, not just necessarily for Conservative members, but equally people who have been officers there for a long time, who are only used to that one party state effectively. So I think, again, 6 and 7 kind of almost merge into one another as questions, in that it is about our presence being there and offering opposition. I think I'll shut up and let someone else talk about the disadvantages now.
Well, I'm not going to talk about the disadvantages. I'm just ignoring them. I know what I want to do, and I'm going to try and do it, and to the best of my ability, and not worry about the numbers. I will make my case and see what happens.
I think one of the issues in certain areas of the borough, I mean, I'm thinking particularly in Leigh Park, is in terms of getting a foothold. We need to persuade people to go out and vote. It's not that they vote Conservative; it's just that they don't vote. In St Faith's, the turnout for the local election was 40%, but last year in Leigh Park, in some of the areas, it was only 18% of people came out to vote. And so, and the reasons for that, you know, you could argue them day and night, but, you know, people are disaffected with politicians. They brand, oh, you politicians, they're all the same. You know, so our challenge is to prove that that's not the case, that they will be heard, we will respond. I respond to every casework that I get. I can't sort every single problem out, but at least an explanation of why I can't goes a long way towards proving that we are doing some work. So, you know, we need to persuade people that it is worth going out to vote.
And not only do we do the work, we actually talk about it as well very, very publicly, which has come as something of a shock to an awful lot of the Conservatives. And very often, actually, where there are frustrations sometimes internally, the reality is that we have to do it politically and we have to do it publicly. And by doing that, we are actually getting a foothold in, because our voices are being heard, because that's democracy. Public pressure and public voice gets behind that. And that's actually healthy for a democracy.
Thank you.
Perfect.
Sorry,
we have reached time.
Amy, sorry, was Amy just going to?
Oh, Sammy, did you want to come in just quickly there?
Sorry.
No.
I was just going to, I think for me personally, one of my biggest advantages and disadvantages is my age. I'm the youngest councillor in Havant, which is very daunting. I am 24, so I wouldn't necessarily class myself as very young or very old. I think I'm somewhere in the middle there. But I find that can be quite difficult for a lot of people who have perhaps been used to older members, and also some of the older members, I think sometimes the ideas I have are pie in the sky, and like, you know, you often get, you know, the socialist utopia sort of brush smeared against you. But I think that it works to my advantage, because there are young people in Warren Park who are messaging me saying, you know, you're inspiring. We're really grateful to have someone like you who's given Leigh Park a platform. And especially because I grew up in the area as well, and I know the area like the back of my hand. You could say, take me to this place, I'll take you there. I know exactly where it is, because it's my home. It always has been my home. And I think that although it does come as quite a big disadvantage for me, it is also a massive advantage for the community, because they're seeing someone who is a local person, who doesn't come from money, doesn't come from a large amount of wealth, being able to have a platform to increase awareness for issues within the wards and within, you know, their area, their home.
Perfect. Amy, thank you. In the interest of time, I think that's a great way to close the show. Thank you, everybody, for your contribution today. And for those of you that have been listening, you've been listening to the Pompey Politics Podcast. I've been Ian Tiny Morris.
Thank you, Ian.
And our guests have been, for Labour, we've had Mark Coates from Hayling East, Amy Redsull from Warren Park, Gillian Harris from St Faith's. From the Lib Dems, we've had Philippa Gray from Bedhampton, Paul Gray from Hayling West. From the Greens, we've had Grainne Rason. And I've been Simon Sansbury. Please do join us again at the same time next week, where we'll be starting the first of our ward reports. So this is a suggestion that one of our viewers put into us that we've actually that we've gone with, and has been received very well. So we'll be turning our attention to Paulsgrove ward in Portsmouth, and inviting the 3 councillors of that ward to come on the show and talk to us about how life is in their wards and what work they've been doing for their residents. So join us next week at 6:27. Please do remember to like, follow, subscribe, etc., etc. Send tea, send biscuits. We will appreciate it. See you next week.
Give us 5 stars wherever you get your podcast.
Okay, do my best. Thank you.